Welcome to Season 5, Episode 10 of Solarpunk Presents, in which Ariel and I discuss the us versus them of community, or the darker side of community. Before we begin Season 5, Episode 10, here's just a little note for y'all, warning you that we'll be on hiatus for August of 2024. In the meantime, you can check out our back catalog of episodes on YouTube or on your favorite podcatcher. Are you craving some summer Solarpunk reading? Check out our blog posts and consider subscribing to our Patreon for more original Solarpunk content from Ariel and myself. Now on to the episode.
Hiya, listeners, and thanks for tuning in to this final episode of Season 5.
Our half-century episode.
Episode 50, the big 5-0.
I can't believe we've hung in here this long.
It helps that there's a Solarpunk community, so we're not just shouting out into the void, but we're talking about things a group of people finds interesting, I hope, and will sometimes even talk back to us about.
Oh, right, so we're not just like the poor little monster in the foghorn, or 50, is it 52? Is that the name of the whale?
I don't know.
Oh, there's a whale who broadcasts on the frequency that none of the other whales talk on.
Oh, I've heard of that whale, and it is a very sad story. I'm going to go back to repressing that now. So,
Anyways, community, speaking of which, today we're talking about the two-sided coin that is community. Who's in and who's out? Who gets to be there? And who has to go kick rocks in the corner of the playground? Probably in the company of me, since I've never met a group I couldn't manage to fail to integrate into. Today, we want to tackle the us versus them of community.
This seems like such a perennial issue, honestly. Anywhere there's a community that comes together, there's the risk of excluding, through intention or accident, other people, or creating a little gate-kept enclave that only certain people get to access, or infighting and splits within that community. And sometimes it's a wonder that communities can stick together at all, given all the humans in them. But Christina, you proposed a topic, so I think you might have something in mind to say about this in particular. So why don't you go ahead and tell us?
Well, like I said, I've never been great at being a part of a community. In fact, I've always been terrible at it. I can be friends, good friends even, with everyone in a tight-knit group of friends, and yet I will, without exception, utterly fail to belong to the group. And yet, I see the power that communities have to get stuff done. Being able to organize ourselves into social groups and work together is, it's the major human skill that has enabled us to create civilization and to develop such incredible cultures and technologies. But being able to sort ourselves into groups also has downsides, like, as you said, exclusion, discrimination, and even war. So anytime Solarpunk starts talking about community, which is all the time, as it is one of the core principles of Solarpunk, I always do this quiet little gulp and play along, even though I don't really know what it means to belong to a community, and I have no idea how you would even go about joining one, even when people explain it to me. And I can't imagine anything worse than having to deal with the rules and the drama that go with being part of a community. That would totally be my worst nightmare. So I'm both happy and sad to be the person who is something between community adjacent and wandering alone through the woods. But also, I come from a culture that circles the wagons.
Apt metaphor for settler society there.
So I've seen that people will do so much for and be so kind and generous to people in their in-group. But they'll shoot you, maybe even literally, if you're not one of their own. And I've always thought that this being kind to their own has always allowed these people to think of themselves as good people, or even better than most other people. Even though they treat, say, people who happen to be a different color than they are, or people who are queer, or even just people who aren't members of their church with considerably less mercy, shall we say.
I hear that.
And the thing that worries me about groups, and is the reason I'm not dying to join any communities, is that they have rules that you have to live by, and I don't like that part of it.
Those are very fair concerns. I have to say that while on the one hand, I as a child and teen never felt that I was able to integrate comfortably into a community as well, I didn't have to try outside of school, which is a whole other different conversation. I grew up in one of those religious groups, even more intense, a cultural religious group. So almost everyone knew each other as part of the Dutch diaspora that had come to Canada after World War II, had attended the same Dutch Christian school, and talked about distant relatives and friends of friends as if you saw them every other week and actually knew who they were, which you actually probably did because you all went to the same church. If not in the same area, then you were in the same denomination.
Yeah, oh my God. That sounds like my worst nightmare. All those people with so many expectations for who you are and how you will behave, who you will socialize with, how you will live your life, and how you will spend your time. I would have felt suffocated. Also, what happens after you have a major falling out with someone when you're in a group like this?
I actually honestly don't know the answer to that because that never actually happened to me. As a kid, I guess I would have just avoided the other kid until our parents like forced us to make up or something, I guess. And since I grew up in that milieu, I never really knew that there was any sort of alternative. So it just kind of seemed like that was the way the world worked for everyone. And I didn't really question it when I was young. I always felt safe and comfortable growing up in this community, which I realize now is a total privilege that not everyone had. And when I was a child, the specifics of doctrine and religious rules were something for my parents to think about and discuss with other adults during the after church coffee time, while I and the other kids stole the rest of the communion loaf and chowed down on it like little gremlins in the back of the empty sanctuary. Good times. Everyone knew me, my parents, and in some cases, my grandparents and other relatives with my last name. When I encountered another person out in the wild with a last name that started with Van or Vander or ended in Sma, I could play and win Dutch bingo, which is basically just a 6 degrees of separation game where you list off your relatives or where they live or where they were from in the Netherlands or even what boat they came over on until you both arrive at a shared connection.
Oh wow. That is so weird to me. You know, aside from this one tiny little town up in the Sierra Madre in Mexico, which is so riven with violence and drug cartels, you'd be totally insane to visit it. There isn't anywhere I can go on Earth and just accidentally bump into someone I might be related to. And I can't tell if that would be a nice thing or a terrible thing, you know, to meet someone you didn't know and find out you had some blood connection to them.
It's kind of both, like it's weird and also comforting. For example, I got so weirded out by running into people I knew from classes in the grocery store of my university town that it made me even more determined to go abroad after my BA, just so I wouldn't get like jump scared by people I knew and I could just mind my own business without interruption. But then when I was returning to Canada, the woman who was helping to check bags in like the Victoria, BC airport had gone to high school with my parents and recognized my last name. So she waived my checked bag fee, which is probably the only time that that's actually worked out for me financially that I know of.
Sorry, jump scared? Are your people that frightening?
I I'm a very tense person. I am wound very tight. I do tend to jump scare quite often in my own home.
Oh, okay. Um, well, I have to admit, the best thing about going off to university was arriving at a place, you know, this is when I was 18, was arriving at a place where nobody had any expectations of who I was. It's so liberating not to have the pressure to be the person everyone thinks you are.
I definitely felt cramped into a certain way of being as a teen, but I think I had it pretty good when I was young, especially as a kid that was like weird enough to get bullied, but not weird enough for adults to think that maybe I should get like diagnosed with something. I still had a place that I belonged simply by virtue of being born into it. So like I was an outcast, but like I was their outcast, you know? So it didn't really matter, at least within like the church and church spaces, that I had zero social skills because I was just sort of accepted for who I was. So I had a community, but I never really had to work for it. So being a part of something comes extremely naturally to me and can be a downside because I'm like that math teacher in grade school who's just intuitively good at mathematical problems and concepts, and as a result is terrible at teaching kids whose brains don't actually work that way because they can't explain it.
Yeah, but I think you probably did work at it. I mean, at least a little. So I've never been part of a church, but I was in marching band in high school. And it wasn't quite the same level of organized community as a church, but it was also an organized community. And, you know, while there were groups of friends within the marching band, and all of us identified as band members and identified each other as band members, and even though being in the band meant an awful lot to some of the people. I wouldn't say we all hung out together or did anything like practice. We didn't even practice music together or anything like that. At least not outside of regularly scheduled rehearsals. So you have to work at it. I mean, although maybe this was just community light or something like that. It wasn't like being in the choir that you had to try out for and was hard to get into, so that they were a really tight-knit bunch. And it wasn't like being one of the thespian type people. As I said, those were some seriously tight-knit communities at my high school.
That's amazing. I had like 200 kids total going to my high school. So we didn't get to have cool things like marching band or theater club or whatever.
Oh, okay. I mean, we had, I think it was like 150 kids just in the marching band, or maybe it was 150 kids in the entertainment unit. So the marching band plus the drill team plus the tall flags. And, this wasn't even a particularly big high school for Los Angeles. I think we had like maybe 1,700 students, I think, at the time. So 510 of them were in my graduating class. So there were tons of people, even just during my year, that I never met, even through those 4 years. I might not even recognize their names. So, and this was during the school kid population bust that was the meager, measly population of Gen Xers that followed the baby boomers. So we had schools closing like crazy all around us because of declining enrollment.
Oh, I mean, that still sounds like so many people to me. But since I've left high school, I've had to learn that working to create a community, it turns out, is actually really hard and it takes a lot of effort. So, especially when you don't have like a shared historical trauma, culture, emigration, language, and a religion to fall back on, or like a shared high school experience, you're not jammed in the same place with the same people all the time. I found out now, as an adult who has left the Dutch Christian Reformed Church mostly behind. I say mostly because it's kind of part of who I am and my family history, and it's not something I can deny or even really want to, but I don't really want to be associated with what it's turned into. I mean, that's a whole different story, maybe for a different podcast. But the short version is that the exclusion of the LGBTQIA plus community has just sort of recently been codified in the CRC Synod, and over 20 congregations left in protest in a single day because a denomination I love is being driven into the ground by heretical, conservative, evangelical forces, and this is dangerously close to rant, and I'm going to pull myself back on track here.
But this is a serious us versus them point about communities. If you can define them by who belongs, you can also certainly define them by who doesn't belong or isn't allowed to belong. And that's a neutral thing in that it can be good and it can also be kind of evil. So if you're like a no Nazis in our group, yeah, I think we can all agree that's good. You're only excluding people who've chosen to hate certain groups of people and have chosen to want to see them die. In the case of excluding queer people, if I can use that as an umbrella term, from your group or society or from society as a whole, it's evil and it causes great harm. And this is a little bit why I freak out inside every time people talk about Solarpunk as being about community and not about individuals. Because community isn't this automatically magical, good, and moral thing. Community is a powerful tool. Community is a group of people coming together to support each other, and more importantly, to get more things done than those people could do, each acting individually. It's about that group of people having political power. Whether or not that community turns out to be one that makes the world a better place is written entirely on another piece of paper.
This reminds me of a conversation that I was having recently with a friend of mine who, along with her husband and two children, has also left the church. She has a background in the Dutch CRC, and while she's still firmly convinced that she's making the right decision by staying away from the church, she's currently mourning the lack of community since it's very, very hard to find something similar outside of the auspices of organized religion. So the example she cited was a church barbecue where kids could just run around and play with other kids under the watchful eyes of many adults who knew them and were just good friends of the family. She hasn't been able to find that elsewhere, and as a working mother of two kids, she doesn't exactly have the time to either create a community of her own on that level or to go seek it out.
When I was 13 or so, I got invited to a barbecue like that by a friend. But it was thrown by the local plumbers union rather than a church. There are options out there if you have access to them, I guess. But yeah, I mean these church things, they're this is why people go to church, right? Just to be a part of something like this.
Yeah, totally. I think that there's a lot of people who attend church who just are really there for the community part of it and like the religion part of it, whatever, but it's the community part that really keeps them coming back every Sunday. And that plumber thing is super neat. I've never actually even heard of such a thing, but I'd love for that to happen. I do think it's possible to create a community similar to that of my childhood. I feel like I have to believe it's possible, honestly. But the reason that community worked for me was because it was brought together by a shared set of core values. You love the Lord your God and you love your neighbor as yourself. That whole thing. It was brought together by a shared experience of emigrating to a new country where you don't speak the language, where customs are foreign, and where you have to work hard to establish yourself in your own institutions. And it was brought together by shared language and sometimes even shared ancestry. So you were related by more than just, like proximity. And it's not like everyone in the community was completely on board with all the tenets of the CRC, by the way. Like it wasn't until the later 20th century that divorce was officially okay, for example, or that women could hold office, or that the church adopted the revolutionary then, but totally insufficient position of hate the sin, love the sinner when it came to their queer members. Because of that shared ancestry, culture, and experience, the community operated like a large family. Like there were eccentric, disagreeable, and stubborn people, sure, and sometimes harsh words were exchanged, but that didn't mean that the relationship was irrevocably sundered because of like one argument.
No wonder I am incapable of community. In my family, one bad incident with someone, and that's it. You're fired. Because of not so long ago violence, political and otherwise, that created trauma and, alcoholism, that created Machiavellian narcissistic psychopaths who created children who never understood that they could be forgiven for any wrongdoing since they never were forgiven for anything, who then grew up unable to forgive anyone for even the slightest trespass, not even their own children, especially during the hot-headed teenage years, and certainly not ever themselves. So, I mean, you're just kind of incapable of community if community takes forgiving and also and the understanding that you can also be forgiven.
I mean, Christianity is supposed to be all about the forgiveness of sins and all that kind of stuff, right? So we're supposed to emulate that. So that was like a big thing. So it was kind of like when you have an argument, then you have the opportunity to demonstrate your forgiveness.
Christina breaking in as I'm editing this to say I am not laughing there as in the background while Ariel is talking. I'm having a bit of a coughing fit because I swallowed water and breathed in at the same time.
It sounds really awful to honestly grow up in a place without forgiveness. And I don't really have a joke or a lighthearted comment about that. Like in my family, the trauma brought us together, but I mean, everybody reacts differently. Being part of community is living with tension, I think. Like personally, I started to feel that tension as a teen because everyone seemed to be obsessed with babies and I wasn't, which was very strange because as someone assigned the gender role of woman, babies are supposed to be my life. And like according to some more conservative or older people, probably it's my sole purpose besides supporting my husband. So I ended up cutting off my hair and I'm still child free and I don't have regrets. And that's not why I left the CRC, but it was definitely the first point of friction that I felt personally that led me to question its ideology.
So this part of community, I totally get. This not fitting in with their ideals part, and so having to leave. And like I said, this is one of the parts of community that I do not like. That in order to belong to a group of people, you have to, at least to some fundamental degree,
Mm.
conform. This is as true for being a member of the Dutch Christian Reformed Church as it is for being a card-carrying neo-Nazi, as
Hmm.
it is for being a solarpunk, even if most of us solarpunks don't know each other in real life. And I'm not sure how you escape it. Although there are communities who come together around shared interests and instead of shared values, and so that's maybe one way to avoid some of this. But if you don't mind me saying so, fuck those fuckers who decided that the Christian values of your church included hating queer people.
Hmm.
But I guess if your shared interest is that particular brand of religion, as opposed to it being that you're a member of a particular diaspora, I guess you're kind of stuck with it. You're kind of stuck with the tenets of the religion. Although, I mean, these are all things people decided. Not to be difficult about that. But anyways, not to be awful and insensitive. But I've also never understood how any woman could be a part of a religion, no matter the social upsides, that has decided that you're the root of all evil and is something that should be obedient to man, even if he's the loseriest loser there is. I mean, how do you swallow that? That you're secondary. I mean, just how do you swallow that just to continue to be a member of the group? I mean, I will take my eternal damnation, thank you, because that is just wrong. And no number of barbecues with great it takes a village childcare is worth putting up with that.
Fair. I mean, when you're born into a community and a culture where that way of life and values set is just all you've ever known, and then you're told that to transgress those values will make your life significantly worse, it can be really difficult, if not impossible, to leave that community, even if it's actively hurting you and hindering your growth. And internalized misogyny is a very real thing, and women can hold up the patriarchy as staunchly, or even more so, honestly, than the men around them. It not only gives them a measure of control over other people, but it justifies their own personal decisions and identity as a woman who has just decided to, or was able to get out of, living in this misogynist culture or community. If another woman starts to live a freer or more feminist life, it then invalidates those older women's choices, or that's the threat that's perceived.
I don't think the women friends I have who are deeply Christian are in it to support the patriarchy. I sort of feel like they just put blinders on and ignore the anti-woman awfulness of their religion and just try to focus on the aspects of it that they like and relate to and find value in. But for that matter, I also don't understand why any decent men adhere to a religion with such a hateful view of women.
That is very worth questioning.
But let's talk for a moment about solarpunk fiction. So many solarpunk stories involve what is essentially an anarchistic group of people coming together to help each other weather a crisis and stick it to the man in the process. And I find these stories oddly demoralizing because I'd never have a place in one of these groups. And to
Hmm.
me, solarpunk fiction should be about all sorts of different ways of envisioning ourselves in a great future. And I don't quite get why we all have to have this same vision of a great future, which again is one I wouldn't personally fit into very well. And so while I get that it's a future in which people bind together and support each other and try to do environmental good works, I would totally hate to live that way. I'm all about living in a future where income and wealth are much more equally distributed, where we all have the freedom to be who we are, where society is kinder and more supportive of people, where we've done something about global warming and environmental destruction, and where we've got an economic system that serves people instead of distilling all the money and power up to the top literal handful of people in the world. But I don't want to have to be bound up in a tight-knit community with all of the social incestuousness, interpersonal conflict, and nitpicky adherence to spoken and unspoken social rules, and the possibility for ostracism that goes along with that. Does that mean I have to hand back my Solarpunk card? Or does it just mean I'm stupidly curmudgeonly about genre fiction?
I don't think solarpunk cards are like a thing. I mean, if they are, I missed the meeting where they handed them out. And I don't think you're stupidly curmudgeonly. I think it's a really valid mindset to be critical of the pedestalization of community because it's easy to fall into it. Heck, I do it all the time because, as we just discussed, I'm kind of biased towards it from my childhood. But the grass is always greener, right?
But getting back to why can't strong communities be secular instead of religious? Here in Germany, there are actually all sorts of ways to find community that don't involve a church. There are labor unions that can be very, very supportive of their members. And there are the various churches and mosques and even some synagogues. But what the country is totally obsessed with is clubs. There are clubs for literally everything. You can join any of the various sports clubs like soccer, ping pong, badminton, sailing, riding, dancing, the German version of bowling, gardening, I mean, you name it.
Wait, there's a German version of bowling?
Well, it's more of a continental European thing than strictly a German thing. I think we would call it nine-pin bowling in English.
Interesting.
They probably actually do bowl together, but mostly they just kind of go on weekend trips with each other. As far as I can
Oh,
tell, they'll rent a
sounds
bus
like
and
book clubs,
yeah, okay, there's probably book clubs here too. Do book club people go on trips together?
I guess it depends on your book club. As I understand it, book clubs are mostly for getting together and socializing and not so much talking about the book itself. The book is a reason to get together, but
Yeah.
maybe not the focal point.
Okay, you can also join a political party. You can join the local volunteer firefighters. Or if you live out in a rural area, you can join the women of the countryside if they'll have you. I mean, even I'm in a club because in order to live where I live, it was mandatory to join the wastewater club, whose dues and volunteer work pay for the lease on and, basically maintain the evaporation pond all our septic systems drain into.
That's hilarious.
And legally, we had to structure ourselves as a club with dues and meetings.
Huh.
They have to have a historian who like takes the minutes and
Wow.
yeah. And so most of these clubs mainly give you the possibility to socialize with other people. Okay, we don't socialize as part of the wastewater club, but we all live on the same street, so we don't really need it. Okay. Um, so it isn't like there's a big in-group, out-group thing going on with most of these clubs, except for maybe with the Landfrauen, so the women of the countryside.
Hmm.
It's not like the ping pong club rumbles with the samba dancers or anything like that.
They don't get into dance battles.
Yeah, yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe how do you say it? The capoeira? I don't know. I don't know if they do that much here. And members of the clubs don't just get together to do their main club activity. As I said, they'll, not, okay, it's not like this in the wastewater club, but they'll go on short vacations together as a group, that sort of thing. Like it's really big here in Germany to go visit a part of the country here that you've never been to before for the weekend.
Ooh,
So
that
that
sounds
you
really
get to know.
nice.
Yeah, it's just big enough that you would need to do that and not so big that that's really difficult to do.
That's lovely. Like the other places I lived, like personally, that had clubs sort of built into the fabric of the culture were university campuses. They're like golfers clubs and yacht clubs, etc., but they seem pretty exclusive based on income. If there are other clubs, it's not like they're very well advertised, I guess. It's not part of the culture here to really encourage your own interests because organizing getting together for something that's not to do with your job is like communism or something.
Oh, I think you're being a bit harsh there. I think it's just a lot of work and it takes a lot of time. But still, gazillions of people run Girl Scout or Boy Scout troops, and not just because their kids are in them or because they have some evil predatory motive, but because they had a great scouting experience when they were kids and would like to pay it forward. And outside of scouting and, the exclusive clubs that rich people or community VIPs use for networking and socializing with their own, oh, and biker gangs and okay, yeah, bowling leagues. I think that we people of the Anglosphere don't really have joining clubs as a big part of our culture. Oh, and youth sports leagues. Those are also sort of clubs.
Oh, right, sports. I guess those are clubs, but I'm just not in that particular fandom, so I remain that outsider. So move over, Christina. I'm coming to join you in that metaphorical corner when we can kick rocks together.
Oh God, as long as we don't end up turning into a community, that's fine. But as long as we're on the subject of sports clubs, one other aspect of some German clubs, especially the sports clubs, is that they exist to foster talent. So my father-in-law was a member of their local village field hockey team, which was actually pretty successful in like the national leagues. In fact, they were so good, they used to go on tour, playing field hockey against other teams in places like Romania that lay behind the Iron Curtain. And after East Germany and the Soviet Union collapsed and he got older, and field hockey wasn't really funded by the government anymore, so there was no longer a league, he got really into teaching the local kids in his village how to play ping pong, since that was one of the other sports offered by their local sports club, and coaching them so that they could get better, and so they could bring home trophies from regional meets. And this sort of framework within these sports clubs is how a lot of kids grow up talented and experienced enough to become Olympic or professional athletes for the German national teams or professional leagues.
Honestly, that sounds like the best iteration of community to me, something that's open to people of all ages and all skill levels, that intentionally fosters a learning atmosphere, where the community is one that's drawn together by a shared love of an activity, but your individuality is actually celebrated for what you as a person can do and contribute instead of just disappearing into the collective. I mean, I think that's what scares a lot of people about the concept of a communistic society is that you'll lose your individuality and always have your needs brushed aside instead for other people. Like all those old sci-fi films and stories about body snatchers and pod people are metaphors for communism, where your friends and loved ones who you thought you knew become suddenly different because of this radicalizing new agenda, which involves primarily becoming part of a collective that doesn't actually care about you as a person with individual desires and needs. Like the whole Borg arc on Star Trek The Next Generation plays with this concept.
Having a spouse and in-laws who grew up in the repression behind the Iron Curtain and are absolutely happy to be free of it, I don't want to make light of it. But it's not like capitalism cares about the needs of the individual either. I mean, at least not more than it needs to in order to make money off of them. And even democracy doesn't really need to make room for everybody's individuality.
I'm not saying capitalism is the opposite of communism as a political system. We tend to conflate communism as like both an economic system and like a social system and a cultural system and a political system, and it gets
Well, the
yeah.
government's so heavily involved, right? So
Exactly. It's so very intertwined. But anyways, so I do want to say that the disappearance of an individual into a collective is a legitimate fear, though. Like anti-communist propaganda may have played it up a lot at mid-century, but there's a reason that it took such a hold in the Western psyche. Living in Japan, which is a very communal society, kind of opened my eyes to both the good side and the bad side of having a very strong group identity. On the one hand, there's very little crime, belongings and people are respected, and people are helped during times of crisis.
wait, sorry, I have to interrupt you. Very little crime, so cyberpunk is all a lie with the Yakuza?
It's speculative fiction. There is the Yakuza. Yeah, yeah.
Have I been saying it wrong all these years?
Yes, I think so. Sorry.
Say it again. Say it again.
Yakuza.
Huh.
Each syllable has the exact same inflection. So I guess there's little disorganized crime. Um, so in the days after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, some of my adult students would show up for lessons with suitcases full of canned goods because right after the lesson, they were going to go hop on a train and bring supplies to the people in the north. It was part of their, civic duty. On the other hand, I learned that in Japan, you don't really talk about mental health or any social problems whatsoever, because that would be showing weakness on behalf of the group. It's not just your own personal failing, it reflects very negatively on the entire group that you're part of. Not everyone feels this way, but enough people do, enough people in positions of power reinforce this paradigm that it's pretty pervasive.
I'll counter this with an I also experienced a strong earthquake, the magnitude 6.9 Loma Prieta earthquake that struck in the Santa Cruz Mountains in 1989.
Mm.
Okay, so that was just a hiccup compared to the 9.0 earthquake in Japan. But among other things, it pancaked a 1.25 mile long double-decker segment of Interstate 880 in Oakland, killing 42 people in what must have been really a nightmare situation, as well as causing one segment of the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge to become unhinged and crash down upon the lower deck. And it destroyed the lovely old brick buildings of downtown Santa Cruz. It also brought out the best in everyone. Everyone came out to help dig people out of the rubble, and since there was no power because the chimneys at the Moss Landing power plant had toppled over, stores gave away ice cream to anyone who came by. And they also gave away bottles of water instead of selling them for an inflated price, since it wasn't yet clear if our tap water was still drinkable. So you can also live in a capitalistic, imperialistic democracy and have disasters bring out the communitarian in almost everyone. Earthquakes are the sort of disasters that unite people and spur them to think about more than just themselves and their own survival.
Christina, when you read my dissertation, why did you not tell me that you basically experienced the real life version of the first science fiction book that I examined?
Uh, Probably because it was 2 in the morning your time as I was reading it. But seriously, jog my memory. Which book was this?
It's literally called Tsunami and it's by Crawford Killian. It's about an earthquake and a following tsunami that hits California and takes out the power system, and there's tons of rubble, etc., etc. But I mean, if it was 2 in the morning, that totally makes sense. It's also in chapter 1, so it probably faded from memory pretty fast.
I also have I don't retain much that I read, I have to confess, for very long. There actually was, we also had a little tsunami after the Loma Prieta earthquake, but it was so tiny you couldn't tell which wave it was.
Hmm.
So I guess that doesn't really count. Let me also say that I don't think you have to live in a communistic or communitarian society for certain things to be taboo either. Admitting to mental health problems is also still kind of new in the West. My parents, for instance, who are still very much alive, are still of the generation who would never dream of going to see a therapist to work through their mental health issues. Or at least they would never dream of admitting that they may have once or twice gone to a therapist to deal with their mental health issues. And there are some pretty severe problems with depression and other disorders in my family, either because we're just built that way, or because of all the trauma and all the psychological abuse that people in my family were subjected to generally as children. And they certainly hate to admit to any social problems. And not just my family, but the culture that I come from, right? So it's also pretty common. You know, I mean, they're called Alcoholics Anonymous, Al-Anon, and Narcotics Anonymous, and so on, for a reason, right? Because all communities and pretty much all societies have standards, are judgmental, have people who use information against other people to bolster or improve their own wealth, power, or position within hierarchies, and have ways and means of ostracizing people who transgress social norms.
Fair, but I would say that it's more of a flexible cultural issue here. Like every family has a slightly different way of dealing with issues like mental health or not dealing with them. And so when someone's outspoken about a taboo issue, they're more often than not given attention, even negative attention, like sensationalized news stories is still bringing it to people's awareness instead of having it covered up or forced into silence.
I can see that in a culture where saving face, being polite, and not making the community look bad are as important as they are in Japan, these issues become even more pronounced. But that just adds further to my case that building community is not a simple answer to all the problems that we as solarpunks want to fix. And it isn't a magical answer by which suddenly everything will be just and right. And okay, maybe I should own up to what are probably the real roots of my distrust of community. Some of this stuff I've probably mentioned or alluded to before, but anyways, I have a great grandfather who was murdered by people in his community as part of the Mexican Revolution. This was about 100 years ago. And I have another great grandfather who was murdered 7 years later while he was dragged out of his house and shot by an extrajudicial firing squad as part of the Cristero War, in which the Mexican state moved to reduce the power of the Catholic Church, and Catholics fought back, and the whole thing escalated into violent uprising in the mid to late 1920s,
Whoa.
especially in the western parts of Mexico. And
Wow.
so this has the shockwaves of this trauma are still reverberating through my family. And then on the other side of the family, as again, as I've probably mentioned on the podcast before, I have a grandfather who, because his community decided that he and his kind were nothing better than vermin, died in a concentration camp, as did almost all of his brothers and sisters, and also very nearly my grandmother and mother as well, who avoided quote unquote deportation to a concentration camp only through a combination of luck and the kindness of the soldier who had come to take them away.
Yikes.
Yeah, this is not that long ago, right? So, which is all to say, by all means, let Solarpunk find the power of community and organization, and let Solarpunk stories illustrate that community is a way to have political power and to really get things done. But let us please not ever forget that coming together and acting as a community is both a powerful tool and a double-edged sword or a two-sided coin or, whatever the most appropriate metaphor is here. Because the actions of a community can support people, but they can also have devastating or even lethal consequences for other people, sometimes simultaneously. Let's face it, jerks will always be with us, as well as the brainwashed and the desperate for power. And in their hands, community becomes a powerful weapon. And, also sometimes the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So
Oh,
I
yeah.
will I will continue to cringe every time Solarpunk goes all ooey gooey about community. And I'd hope that Solarpunks never take their eyes off the ball, that even great communities can be a way to sort people into us versus them, and a way to cause great harm to someone who may or may not deserve it via ostracism. And it's good not to forget that human beings have this historical tendency toward great violence. I mean, well, not just historical, as many people in the world today could still tell you.
On that note, I think it's a very wise impulse to question communities and provide constructive critiques of them. I understand that at their outset, communities can seem like a very fragile thing, especially when they're like forming amongst people who don't really know how to be in community with each other because of the isolationist, individualist cultures they've been raised in. But in my experience, if a community crumbles because it's facing too much in the way of criticism, it wasn't much of a community to start with. In the same way that one's faith isn't worth much if questioning it can easily lead to its abandonment, communities that dissolve because you poked them with a stick, like, for example, you suggested that maybe you should all work harder to be anti-racist and called in some of the other members for microaggressions. They weren't very good communities to be part of anyway if they fall apart because of that.
Christina checking in here as I'm editing this episode, and as I'm listening to this, I have this feeling that Ariel recently read an article in the New Yorker entitled Losing a Beloved Community about the unraveling of the City of Hope radical evangelical church due to infighting. It sounds exactly like what she's talking about here. It's a really interesting article. Check it out. I'll put the link in the description. Okay, back to our discussion.
So if a community that you're part of is starting to get into the us versus them debate, or you notice that it is creating those conditions, calling in the members responsible is one of the best things that you can do for the health of the community. I'm not advising mean-spirited nitpicking or criticism without any constructive feedback attached to it to make the collective a better experience for everyone. No community is going to be perfect, in the same way that no human being is going to be perfect. And I would hope that Solarpunks would take that into account and use kindness and compassion when addressing any intra-community issues. Communities are always going to be much harder and weirder and full of jerks than any idolized version, and that's just a reality that needs to be lived with.
It's a tricky tightrope, I think. Holding a community true to its ideals without using that as a weapon or a straitjacket.
I think when it comes to community, we've boiled it down to different people are going to react differently to the idea of community and how they participate or don't in the communities around them. So basically, don't pedestalize community, don't make it mandatory, and don't be afraid to critique it to make it better.
Okay, that's a lighter spin I would have put on it, but it is important that people be allowed to critique it. I'm thinking of, everyone who's saying you're not very patriotic if you criticize the country that you live in because you'd like to make it better. But if I could add my significantly darker take, I'd say that, again, communities are a powerful mechanism that can be used for good and also for great harm. So in my Solarpunk future, people wouldn't just automatically think that communities are the magical solution to everything, but would respect that community, again, is this powerful tool that you have to be careful with because it can savage people as well as support them.
Let's not take this as a downer so much as a warning, I guess. There are great things about community, but we should not let the positives completely eclipse the negatives. And don't be afraid to be good trouble, basically.
All right, Solarpunks, you heard the lady. Get out there and be good trouble. Meanwhile, have a good couple of weeks, and we'll be back again in September of 2024. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel Kroon and Christina De La Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay Solarpunk.